They branded her a thief, but she would return with a weapon they never expected. It began not with a bang, but with the sound of bare feet against stone, a desperate, tearing rhythm in the heart of a forgotten valley. The moon was just a sliver, a cold shard of glass in a black velvet sky, and it offered no comfort, no light, only a pale, ghostly sheen on the dust of the road. Her name was Ilara, and she was 19 years old. She was running from a life that had just been stolen from her, each ragged breath a cloud of white in the frigid pre-dawn air. The cold was a living thing, biting at her arms, her legs, her face, but it was nothing compared to the fire that had been seared into her soul only moments before. This was not just a flight for survival. It was the frantic escape of a ghost from her own grave, a soul cast out into the unforgiving darkness of Haven's End. The town itself was a collection of weary, sun-bleached shacks huddled together as if for warmth, a place that had long ago given up on its own name. There was no haven here, only an end to dreams, an end to hope, and tonight, an end to the life Ilara had always known. The man responsible for this ending was Silas Blackwood, a landowner whose cruelty was as vast as his holdings. He was a man carved from the very rock and shadow of the valley, with a heart to match. Moments ago, he had dragged her from the warmth of her family's small home, a place held together by little more than love and patched-up wood. He had hauled her into the town square before the silent, watching eyes of everyone she had ever known, and he had declared her a thief. The crime? A single loaf of bread, he claimed, stolen to feed her sick father and her little brother Leo. It was a lie, a cruel and carefully crafted performance. The bread was an excuse, a piece of theater designed to teach a lesson to the entire town, a grim reminder of who held the power. Ilara's pleas, her desperate cries of innocence, were swallowed by the night and met with Blackwood's cold, dismissive laugh. That sound, more than the accusation itself, was what broke something inside her. It was the sound of absolute power, of a man who could erase a person's truth with a single, contemptuous breath. He cast her out then and there, his voice booming across the silent square, declaring her family's debt forfeit. Their home, their land, everything they had, would be his by sunrise, and the townspeople, her neighbors, the families she had shared meager meals with, they simply watched. Their faces were a gallery of silent condemnation, their fear of Blackwood a wall she could not penetrate. Now, on that desolate road, terror was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She was not just homeless, not just poor. She was an outcast. The isolation was a chilling, suffocating blanket, far colder than the wind that whipped her tattered dress around her thin frame. She was utterly and completely alone, a pariah in the only world she had ever known. The thought of her father, his cough already weak and rattling, and of Leo, her bright, innocent brother, facing the dawn without her, was a torment that eclipsed any physical pain the sharp stones under her feet could inflict. Her life, she was certain, was over. The injustice of it all was a poison, a slow burning acid eating away at her from the inside, leaving nothing but a hollow shell of who she used to be. And you, who are listening to this, have you ever felt that? Have you ever known that chilling silence when the world you trust turns its back on you, when you are judged and condemned by people who refuse to see the truth? It is a unique kind of pain, a loneliness so profound it feels like the end of the world. If you have ever stood in that desolate place, with the weight of a false accusation on your shoulders, then you know the darkness Ilara was running through. It is a darkness of the soul, where hope struggles to draw even a single breath. If this story already touches a place in your heart, a memory of a time you were misunderstood, let us know in the comments. Your story matters, just as Ilara's was about to matter in a way no one could have ever imagined. To understand the weapon she would one day wield, you must first understand the secret she carried. It was not a knife or a hidden coin. It was a small, soot-stained piece of charcoal. In a world that demanded her hands be rough and Calloused from pulling weeds and hauling water, Ilara's soul yearned to create. Since she was a child, she would scavenge for burnt wood, for flat stones, for anything that could hold an image. In secret, she would sketch the world not as it was, but as it could be. She drew her little brother's smile, the way the sunlight caught in her mother's hair, the defiant bloom of a single wildflower in a cracked field. These drawings were her silent rebellion, a testament to a spirit that refused to be. Crushed by the grey, oppressive reality of Haven's End, this art was her most private truth. This gift, this way of seeing, was a legacy from her mother. Her mother was a woman who could find beauty in the cracks of the sun-baked earth, who taught Ilara that even in a world of dust and debt, there was light to be found if you knew how to look. But an illness, a simple fever that could have been cured with a few coins' worth of medicine, had stolen her away. Poverty was the disease, and the fever was just its symptom. That loss had carved a hollow in Ilara's heart, a wound that never truly healed. She filled that emptiness with a fierce, protective love for her father and Leo. They were her universe now, the last remnants of that world of light her mother had shown her. She would have done anything to protect them, and in her mind tonight, she had failed. Her father was a good man, but a broken one. Years of toiling under Blackwood's thumb had stooped his shoulders and etched lines of perpetual worry onto his face. His body was failing, worn down by labor that yielded just enough to keep them in debt, but never enough to get them out. And then there was Leo, whose eyes, unlike everyone else's in Haven's End, still saw a world of wonder. He was the keeper of her hope, the reason she still sketched in secret. Her own dream, a fragile fantasy of one day leaving this place to study art, had been buried long ago under the weight of her father's illness and the family's ever-growing debt. Her hands, which she once imagined holding fine brushes, were now raw and stained with dirt, chained to the very fields that were being stolen from them. The conflict with Silas Blackwood had been a slow, simmering fire, not a sudden explosion. It began years ago with his sneering remarks about her father's weakness, his inability to work harder, to pay more. It escalated to public humiliations in the town square, Blackwood reading out their debts for all to hear, relishing the shame he inflicted. But lately it had become more personal, more sinister. She had felt his gaze on her, a lecherous, possessive stare that made her skin crawl. He saw the quiet fire in her eyes, the unbroken line of her spine, and he hated it. Her defiance, however silent, was an affront to his total authority. He needed to extinguish that spark. The stolen bread was not the reason. It was the weapon he chose to finally crush her, to seize their land, and to break the last defiant spirit in his valley. As she stumbled through the darkness, her mind was a whirlwind of guilt and shame. The terror of the present was matched only by the torment of the past. Had she brought this upon them? Was it her pride, her refusal to lower her eyes when Blackwood looked at her, that had provoked his wrath? This question burned hotter than the cold. The thought that her own spirit might have been the catalyst for her family's destruction was an agony worse than any punishment Blackwood could devise. She was at the absolute bottom of her existence, a point where the will to keep putting one foot in front of the other was beginning to fade. What was the point of running when she had nowhere to go? What was the point of surviving when the people she lived for were lost to her? The world was spinning, the thin moonlight playing tricks on her tired eyes. The road ahead was a ribbon of pale dust, unwinding into an endless night. She could feel her strength leaving her, her legs trembling, her resolve crumbling into dust, just like the earth beneath her feet. This is it, she thought. This is the end. She slowed, her frantic pace becoming a weary stumble, ready to simply fall, to let the cold and the darkness take her. The fight was gone. Blackwood had won. He had not just taken her home, he had taken her will to live. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by her own ragged sobs and the whisper of the wind through the dry brush. But then, a new sound, Not the wind, not an animal. It was the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the gravel road ahead. Her head snapped up, her heart seizing in her chest. Was it one of Blackwood's men, sent to finish the job, to make sure the outcast never returned? Fear, sharp and electric, shot through her, momentarily overriding her despair. She froze, trying to melt into the shadows at the side of the road, her breath caught in her throat. A silhouette began to separate itself from the deeper gloom, a figure walking. Toward her, unhurried, calm. It was the shape of a man, tall but not menacing, his pace steady and measured. He was not from Haven's End. She knew that instantly. No one from her town walked with such purpose, such an absence of fear. As he drew closer, the sliver of moonlight caught the details of his form. He was older, his clothes simple but clean, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that was utterly alien to this land of broken spirits. He was a traveler, a stranger, a complete, unknown in a world where anything unknown was a threat. Ilara's mind raced. Should she run, hide, scream? But her body was paralyzed, trapped between exhaustion and a new, terrifying uncertainty. Her frantic escape from one monster had led her directly into the path of another. Or had it? The night was far from over, and her story was about to take a turn she could never have foreseen. The man, Kyle, did not rush to her side. He simply stopped a few paces away, a still point in the swirling chaos of her mind. The moonlight was thin, but it was enough to see the lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke not of age or hardship, but of long miles and deep thought. He was not a farmer. His hands were clean. He was not a merchant. He carried no wares. He was an anomaly, a question mark on a road that only ever led to predictable misery. He bent down, his movement slow and deliberate, and picked up a small, dark object that had fallen from her dress during her stumble. It was a piece of wood, flattened on one side, stained with the familiar black of charcoal. On its surface was a drawing, a quick, desperate sketch of a young boy's face, captured in a moment of pure, unburdened laughter. It was Leo. Kyle held it not with pity, but with a kind of reverence, as if he were holding a rare and precious artifact. He looked from the drawing to Ilara's face, and in his eyes she saw not the judgment of a stranger, but the recognition of a fellow soul. He said nothing, and for a long moment, the only sound was the lonely wind whispering through the brittle, thirsty weeds that lined the road. His silence was more profound than any words of comfort could have been. It was a silence that acknowledged her pain without trying to diminish it. A silence that seemed to understand the depth of the world from which she was running. To understand that world, you have to understand the dust. In Haven's End, the dust was more than just dirt. It was a part of the air you breathed. The food you ate, the lines on your father's face. It was the physical manifestation of a forgotten place, a valley choked by poverty and ruled by the suffocating presence of Silas Blackwood. The town itself was a testament to resignation. The buildings leaned on each other for support, their wood bleached to the color of bone by a sun that gave no warmth, only a relentless, punishing heat. Hope was a currency scarcer than water. The people of Haven's End were bound together not by community, but by a shared, unspoken agreement to endure. They were all in debt to Blackwood, trapped in a cycle that was impossible to break. He owned the land, the water, the single store that sold them seeds at inflated prices and bought their meager harvests for a pittance. He owned their futures, and they knew it. Their silence in the square as Ilara was cast out was not born of malice, but of a deep, hollowed-out fear. They saw her not as a thief, but as a warning. Her fate was a reminder of their own precarious existence, and to stand with her would have been to invite that same fate upon their own families. Have you ever lived in a place like that? A place where the silence is louder than any scream, where people lower their eyes not out of shame, but out of a desperate need to remain invisible. It is a world where kindness is a risk, and solidarity is a forgotten luxury. The weight of that collective fear presses down on you, making your own spirit feel as brittle and dry as the cracked earth beneath your feet. It is a world designed to make you feel utterly and completely alone, even when you are surrounded by people. This was the world that had shaped Ilara, the world that had tried and failed to extinguish the small, stubborn flame she carried inside her. That flame had been lit by her mother. Her mother, Anya, had been an artist in a world that had no use for art. She didn't use charcoal or paint. She used what she had. She could arrange a handful of wildflowers in a cracked jug and make it look like a royal bouquet. She could tell a story that would make Leo forget his hunger for an hour. She taught Ilara to see the color in the grey dust, to notice the intricate pattern of a spider's web glistening with dew, to find the one resilient green shoot pushing its way through the hardpan soil. "Beauty is a kind of defiance, my love," she used to say, her voice a soft melody against the harsh rhythm of their lives. "They can own the land, but they can never own what you see." Her mother was the light, the warmth, the living proof that a soul could bloom even in the most barren ground. But that light had been snuffed out. The illness came on slowly, a cough that deepened, a fever that refused to break. The town had no doctor, only an old woman who knew of herbs and poultices. The real medicine, the kind that could have saved her, was a day's ride away in a town they could not afford to reach, sold for a price that was more than they earned in a year. Blackwood had been approached, a plea for a small advance, a loan against future harvests. He had listened to Ilara's father with a cold, dismissive smile, and then refused. It wasn't a matter of money, Ilara knew. It was a matter of power. A healthy, hopeful family was a threat. A grieving, broken one was a compliant asset. Her mother's death was not a tragedy, it was a transaction. It was the moment Ilara truly understood that poverty was not a condition, it was a weapon. After her, mother was gone. The charcoal became Ilara's only solace. It was her secret conversation with the woman she had lost. She would draw her mother's hands, trying to remember the way they had felt, braiding her hair. She would sketch the curve of her smile, fighting against the fading of her memory. But soon the drawings became something more. They became a record, a testament. She drew the exhaustion in her father's shoulders, the worry that had become a permanent part of his face. She drew the hopeful eyes of the town's children, their innocence a stark contrast to the weary resignation of their parents. Her art was no longer just about finding beauty, it was about holding on to truth. Each sketch was a silent act of rebellion, a declaration that these lives, these struggles, this pain, it all mattered. It was a truth she kept hidden, a weapon she didn't yet know how to wield. Her father, John, had once been a strong man. She had vague memories of him lifting her onto his shoulders. His laughter a deep rumbling sound that made her feel safe, but years of working Blackwood's land had ground him down, physically and spiritually. He was a good man trapped in a system designed to punish goodness. He worked from before sunrise to after sunset, his body aching, his hands cracked and bleeding, all for a share of the crop that was never quite enough to clear their debt. Blackwood was a master of this cruel arithmetic, always finding a reason to dock their pay, a blight on the crops, a tool that needed replacing, a late payment fee. John never fought back. He had seen what happened to men who did. He simply endured, his silence a shield he thought was protecting his family, but it was a shield that was slowly crushing the man inside. And then there was Leo. He was the keeper of her mother's light, the reason Ilara still bothered to look for color in the grey. He was too young to understand the full weight of their poverty, to see the shadow of Blackwood that loomed over their lives. For him the world was still a place of simple wonders. A bright blue beetle was a treasure. A story before bed was a grand adventure. Protecting that innocence became Ilara's life's purpose. It was for him she worked beside her father in the fields, her muscles screaming in protest. It was for him she patched their clothes and stretched their meager meals. Her own dreams of seeing a world beyond the valley, of studying art, of becoming something more than a farmer's daughter, in debt, had long since been packed away like childish toys. Her family was her world now, and that world was on the verge of collapsing. The conflict that led to this night had been a slow poison, not a sudden blow. It began subtly, with Blackwood's presence becoming more frequent at their small plot of land. He would watch her work, his eyes lingering in a way that had nothing to do with the quality of her labor. It was a look that stripped her down, that made her feel like another one of his possessions. He would make comments, his voice laced with a predatory charm, about how a girl with her spirit shouldn't be wasting away in the dirt. He was testing her, probing for a weakness, for a sign that she could be bent to his will. Her refusal to meet his gaze with anything but cold defiance was an insult he could not tolerate. He was a man who demanded fear and submission, and she offered him neither. This silent war of wills escalated. He began to humiliate her father in public, calling him out in the town square for being a few days late on a payment, his voice dripping with false concern that was more cutting than any insult. He wanted to break her by breaking the man she loved. He wanted to show her that her pride, her quiet strength, was meaningless. The townspeople watched these displays with downcast eyes. They gossiped in hushed tones, some with pity, others with a cruel kind of satisfaction. "The girl holds her head too high," they would whisper. "She thinks she's better than the rest of us." Their whispers were just another symptom of the sickness that infected Haven's End, a fear so pervasive that it had turned inward, making them suspicious of anyone who didn't bow their head as low as they did. The lie about the bread was not a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated, strategic move. It was the culmination of his campaign to crush her spirit. By branding her a thief, he attacked her honor. By taking their home, he attacked her family. And by casting her out, he sought to erase her completely. He needed to make an example of her, to prove to everyone in the valley that no amount of pride or defiance could stand against his absolute power. He had not just thrown her out of her home. He had thrown her out of her own life, severing every tie, every connection, every piece of the identity she had ever known. He had left her with nothing, or so he thought. Back on the road, the cold had begun to seep deep into her bones, the adrenaline of her escape had faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She looked at the stranger, Kyle, still holding the small sketch of her brother. His presence was a strange anchor in the dizzying sea of her despair. He had seen a piece of her soul, the one thing she thought she had kept hidden, the one thing she believed was worthless in this brutal world. He finally broke the silence, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the ragged, tearing sound of her own breathing. He didn't offer her food or shelter. He didn't offer her a way to escape. He simply looked at her, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in her life. "They took your home," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that seemed to push back the darkness. "They took your name, but they could not take this." He held up the drawing, the image of Leo's smile a small beacon of light in the gloom. "This is a truth they cannot erase. A man like Blackwood builds his power on lies, on making people feel small and alone. He twists words to suit his purpose, but a picture tells a truth that needs no translation." Ilara stared at him, confusion warring with a tiny, flickering ember of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet, it was curiosity. What was this man talking about? Her drawings were just charcoal on wood, secret whispers against a deafening roar of injustice. He took a step closer, his expression serious, his eyes burning with a conviction that was both frightening and compelling. "You ran from that town to save your life," he said. "But what if I told you that the only way to truly save yourself and your family is to go back?" The idea was so absurd, so utterly insane that a hysterical laugh almost escaped her lips. Go back? Back to the place that had condemned her? Back to the man who wanted to destroy her? It was a death sentence. But Kyle wasn't finished. He wasn't talking about going back as a beggar or a fugitive. He was talking about returning as something else entirely. What he proposed next was not a plan for survival. It was a blueprint for a war fought not with swords or stones, but with the one weapon they never expected her to have, and it would require her to walk back into the very heart of the fire that had just consumed her. The plan Chaol laid out was not a comfort, it was a terror. To return to Haven's End was to walk willingly into her own grave. The idea that a few strokes of charcoal could stand against the iron will of Silas Blackwood felt like a child's fantasy, a fairy tale whispered in the dark to ward off monsters that were all too real. Her entire being screamed in protest. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of survival in that valley, told her to run further, to find a new darkness to hide in, one where the name Blackwood was just a meaningless sound. The weapon he spoke of felt like a feather against a fortress wall. It was the tool of her secret solace, her private grief. To imagine it as an instrument of war was a leap of faith her broken spirit could not make. Her fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every word he spoke, a poison that whispered of the futility of it all. What he was asking for was not courage, it was madness. But Chaol was patient. He did not push or cajole. He simply led her away from the desolate road, up into the rocky hills that overlooked the valley like silent, ancient sentinels. There, hidden behind a curtain of withered vines, was a shallow cave, a wound in the mountainside. It was sheltered from the wind and invisible from the town below. This, he explained, would be her sanctuary and her workshop. He had supplies stashed there, a bedroll, dried food, water, and most importantly, large, smooth slabs of slate scavenged from an old quarry, and a seemingly endless supply of charcoal sticks. He was not asking her to march back into the lion's den at dawn. He was asking her to retreat, to gather her strength, to forge her weapon in secret. The first step was not confrontation, but creation. This small, tangible plan was something her terrified mind could grasp. It was a single step, and for now, that was all she could manage. The first drawing was an act of pure agony. Chaol had given her a simple instruction: draw the truth that hurts the most. And so, she drew her mother. Her hand trembled as she touched the charcoal to the cold, grey slate. It was not a weapon she was wielding. It was a memory. She drew the hollows that had formed under her mother's eyes, the faint, brave smile that never quite reached them in those final weeks. She sketched the hands that had once been so full of life, now resting limp and frail upon a worn blanket. Each line was a ghost, each smudge of shadow a fresh wave of grief. The air in the cave grew thick with the past, with the suffocating weight of what had been stolen from her. When she was finished, she did not see a drawing. She saw an accusation. It was a silent testament to a life extinguished by poverty, a death sentence signed by Blackwood's indifference. She stared at it, her body racked with sobs, the dust of the charcoal mixing with the tears on her cheeks, turning them to streaks of grey mud. Chaol let her grieve, but when her tears subsided, he pushed her again, gently but firmly. "Your pain is the heart of this," he said, his voice a low hum in the quiet of the cave. "But it cannot be the whole of it. His power comes from making everyone believe their suffering is their own private shame. You must show them that their pain is your pain. You must draw their story, not just yours." And so she began to draw the faces of Haven's End from memory. She drew Old Man Hemlock, a farmer whose shoulders were permanently stooped, as if he were still carrying the weight of the harvest Blackwood had seized for a pittance. She drew Sarah, the baker's wife, her eyes wide with a constant, simmering fear ever since her husband had spoken out of turn and been punished with a doubled debt. She drew the children, their faces smudged with dirt, their games played in the shadow of a future that had already been decided for them. The cave began to fill with these silent ghosts, a gallery of quiet desperation, each portrait a single voice in a chorus of shared suffering. To draw the present, she had to see it. Disguised in a hooded cloak Chaol provided, she began to make furtive trips to the edge of the town under the cover of twilight. The first time she saw her old home, a wave of nausea washed over her. A different family was there now, one of Blackwood's sycophants, their laughter echoing from the windows of the house her father had built with his own hands. From a ridge, she watched her father and Leo. They were living in a dilapidated shed behind the stables, a place not fit for animals. She saw her father's cough, heard its rattling echo on the evening air, worse than before. She saw Leo, his bright spirit dimmed, his shoulders already learning the defeated slump of the valley's men. To see them so close, to be separated by nothing more than a few hundred yards of open ground and an entire world of fear, was a unique and exquisite torture. It fueled a rage so cold and so deep, it felt like the only thing keeping her standing. The injustice was not a memory, it was a living, breathing monster, and it was growing stronger. During one of her hidden observations, she witnessed Blackwood in his element. He stood in the town square, the same spot where she had been condemned, and he was evicting the Hemlock family. He wasn't just taking their home, he was performing a ritual of humiliation. He read a list of their debts aloud, his voice dripping with mock pity for all to hear. He spoke of their supposed laziness, their inability to manage their affairs, painting them as failures responsible for their own ruin. And the townspeople watched, just as they had watched her. But this time it was different. The fear was thicker, more suffocating. Their heads were bowed even lower. Their faces were masks of practiced indifference. Blackwood had used her exile to tighten his grip, to remind everyone that any spark of defiance would be met with total annihilation. The silence was no longer passive, it was complicit. That night, emboldened by a desperate need to feel some human connection, she made a mistake. She saw Martha, a woman who had been her mother's closest friend, gathering herbs by the edge of the woods. Ilara called out to her, her voice a raw whisper. For a moment, Martha's face registered shock, then a flicker of recognition, of pity. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a stark, animal terror. The woman shook her head, her eyes wide, and scurried away without a word, as if Ilara were a plague carrier. A few moments later, Ilara heard the whispers from a nearby cottage. "The thief is back. She's a ghost, a bad omen. She'll bring Blackwood's wrath down on us all." The words were like stones, each one striking a fresh bruise on her soul. They had not just abandoned her, they had accepted Blackwood's lie. They had made it their own truth because it was safer than the alternative. Have you ever felt the sting of that kind of betrayal? Not from an enemy, but from your own people, the ones you thought were part of your world. It is a loneliness that hollows you out from the inside, a judgment that makes you question your own reality. When the world you know chooses a comfortable lie over your painful truth, you begin to wonder if you are the one who is insane. If you have ever been on the receiving end of that cold shoulder, that fearful glance, that whispered condemnation, then you know the despair that settled over Ilara that night. It was the moment she truly understood that she wasn't just fighting Blackwood. She was fighting the fear he had planted in the heart of every single person in the valley, a fear that had now taken root and was choking the very soul of the community. She fled back to the cave, the whispers chasing her through the darkness. Her resolve crumbled. She collapsed in front of Cale, the carefully constructed walls of her anger and purpose dissolving into a flood of despair. "They hate me," she choked out, the words tearing at her throat. "They believe him. What's the point of this? These drawings, they're just pictures. They won't change anything." She looked at the gallery of faces staring back at her from the slate walls, their painted suffering a mockery of her own. She felt like a fool, a child playing with charcoal, while the world burned down around her. Kyle listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "They don't hate you, Ilara," he said, his voice a steady anchor in her storm. "They fear him, and he has taught them to aim that fear at you. You are not their enemy, you are their mirror. And right now they are terrified of their own reflection. A few days later, a sliver of light broke through her despair. While watching the town from her hidden perch, she saw Leo. He was alone for a moment, chasing a butterfly near the edge of the woods. He looked up toward the hills as if he knew she was there. Their eyes met across the distance. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated recognition and love. He raised a small hand in a furtive wave before her father called him back, his voice sharp with anxiety. That single, silent exchange was like a draught of water in a desert. It was a reminder of what she was fighting for, a truth that no lie could tarnish. The image of his smile burned itself into her mind, a shield against the whispers and the cold stares. She returned to the cave with a renewed, ferocious determination and began to draw her most powerful piece yet, a portrait of Blackwood himself. But Blackwood was not idle. The whispers of a ghost at the edge of town, of a hooded figure seen in the twilight, had reached his ears. He was a man who thrived on control, and the idea of something moving in the shadows beyond his sight was an intolerable affront. He became a man possessed by a new paranoia. He doubled the patrols around the town's perimeter. He put his men on high alert, their eyes scanning the hills with a new intensity. Then he made a public proclamation. He offered a generous reward, enough to clear a family's debt for a year, for any information leading to the capture of the fugitive thief, Ilara. He had turned the entire town into a network of bounty hunters. He had put a price on her head, transforming her from an outcast into a quarry. Now, every neighbor was a potential betrayer, every familiar face a mask for an informant. The valley, which had once been her prison, was now her hunting ground. The pressure became unbearable. The risk of her trips to the town was now too great. The cave, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. One evening, Kale left to replenish their supplies from a cache further in the mountains, promising to be back by morning. Ilara was left alone with the silent, accusing faces on the walls and the howling of the wind, which sounded like the whispers of the townspeople. She stared at the finished portrait of Blackwood. She had captured him perfectly, the cruelty in his eyes, the sneer of contempt on his lips, the shadow he cast over everything. But it was just charcoal on slate. It was art. It was powerless. The weight of her failure, of her foolish hope, crashed down on her. What was she doing? She was going to get herself killed. And for what? To show a few drawings to people too terrified to even look her in the eye. A wave of pure nihilistic despair washed over her. It was over. The plan was a fantasy. Survival was the only thing that mattered. With a guttural cry of anguish, she picked up a heavy rock, raising it high above her head, ready to smash the slate portraits to dust, to obliterate the foolish dream and run until there was nothing left of Haven's End but a bad memory. Just as her arms began their downward swing, a sound from the mouth of the cave made her freeze, her heart stopping in her chest. A twig snapped. It was not the sound of Kyle's steady, measured footstep. Someone else was there, standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight, their silhouette a dark, unreadable question. Against the dying light of the sky, the rock in her hand felt impossibly heavy, a solid piece of the world's indifference she was about to bring down on her own fragile hope. The sound of the snapping twig was sharp, a crack in the suffocating silence of the cave. Ilara froze, her muscles screaming, the rock held high like a mad priestess about to perform a sacrifice. The silhouette at the cave's mouth was not large, not menacing, but it was an intrusion, a violation of the one place in the world she had believed was hers alone. Her breath caught, a painful knot in her throat. Every horror she could imagine flashed through her mind. One of Blackwood's men, a bounty hunter, a final, merciless end to her foolish rebellion. The figure took a hesitant step forward, into the flickering edge of the firelight, and the face that emerged from the shadows was not one of cruelty or greed. It was a face she knew as well as her own reflection, a face now etched with a new and terrible sorrow. It was old man Hemlock. He looked ancient, a man made of dust and grief. His shoulders, always stooped from a lifetime of labor, seemed to have collapsed in on themselves entirely. He held no weapon, only a small, empty burlap sack clutched in one gnarled hand. His eyes, usually downcast and avoiding contact, now fixed on her with a raw, unnerving intensity. They were not the eyes of an accuser or an informant. They were the eyes of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Elara slowly, cautiously lowered the rock, though she did not let it go. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of suspicion and confusion. Why was he here? Had he followed her to claim the reward, to trade her life for a year of freedom from debt? The thought was a bitter acid in her mouth. The betrayal from Martha had taught her that even the oldest bonds could be dissolved by fear. Hemlock took another shuffling step into the cave, his gaze sweeping over the slate walls. Over the gallery of haunted faces she had brought to life in charcoal. He stopped at the portrait of his own wife, her expression of quiet, constant worry captured with a devastating accuracy. A sound escaped his throat, a dry, ragged sob that seemed torn from the very depths of his soul. "I saw you," he rasped, his voice the sound of grinding stones. "Days ago, up on the ridge, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that you were a ghost come back to haunt us." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not condemnation, but a desperate, pleading question. "They took it all, girl, this morning, the house, the fields, everything, my Mary. She hasn't spoken a word since." He wasn't there for the bounty. He was there because he had nowhere else to go. He had come to the ghost because he too was now a ghost in his own life. In that moment, something inside Elara shifted. The cold, hard knot of despair that had been lodged in her chest for days, for weeks, began to dissolve. The rock slipped from her grasp, thudding softly onto the dusty floor of the cave. She was not alone. The crushing weight of her isolation, the belief that she was a singular pariah fighting a battle no one else could see, lifted. Hemlock's presence was a testament, a living, breathing validation of every truth she had tried to capture with her charcoal. Her art was not a mad fantasy. It was real. The pain she drew was his pain. The injustice she depicted was the air he now breathed. He was the first crack in the wall of silence, the first person to step out of the crowd of fearful shadows and acknowledge the monster that was devouring them all. He did not offer hope or a plan. He offered something far more valuable. He offered a shared truth. He began to walk along the walls, his rough fingers tracing the outlines of the faces she had drawn. He knew them all. He pointed to a sketch of a young boy. "That's the miller's son," he whispered. "They took his father's mill last." Season over a debt for spoiled grain Blackwood sold him in the first place. He moved to another, a portrait of a woman staring into the distance. Widow Abernathy. Her husband worked himself into an early grave trying to clear their name. Blackwood owns her land now, and she works it for him for less than scraps. He was giving her names, histories, context. He was filling her silent gallery with the sound of their stolen lives. He was adding his voice to her images, and together they were. Creating a symphony of truth that was becoming too loud to ignore. The small fire in the center of the cave, which had been dying down to embers, seemed to find new life, its flames leaping higher, casting the portraits in a stark, dramatic light, pushing the oppressive darkness further into the corners. Then Hemlock's voice dropped even lower, his eyes darting toward the cave entrance as if Blackwood himself might be listening on the wind. "He's getting reckless," the old man said, anew. Urgency in his tone. "He's grown too comfortable in his power. He thinks we are all sheep, too broken to ever bite back." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of dust and sorrow. "I was cleaning out the stables after he threw us out. He was in his study with the door ajar talking to one of his men from the city. He was bragging." Hemlock paused, swallowing hard. "He keeps a ledger, girl, a secret one. Not the official books he shows the magistrate, This one has everything. The real. Numbers, the names of families he cheated, the illegal interest rates, the land he seized through lies, it's all in there. His whole empire of dirt and pain, written down in his own hand. This revelation struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. A ledger. Proof. Her art could stir the heart, it could awaken the soul. But this was a weapon that could break the man himself. It was a truth that even the most fearful and complicit town official could not ignore. Suddenly, the plan was no longer just about a public display of defiance. It had a second, sharper point. The art would be the diversion, the great emotional spectacle that would draw every eye, including Blackwood's. It would be the cover under which a different kind of truth could be seized. Just as this new, audacious strategy began to form in her mind, another figure appeared at the mouth of the cave. It was Cale, returned from his journey. He took in the scene in an instant. Ilara, her eyes alight with a new, ferocious fire. Old Man Hemlock, his grief transformed into a fragile alliance. The portraits on the wall no longer just images of suffering, but a battle plan in the making. A slow, knowing smile touched Cale's lips. The spark he had nurtured was about to become an inferno. Ilara looked from the determined face of Cale to the desperate hope in Hemlock's eyes, and she felt the last vestiges of fear burn away, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She was no longer a fugitive running from a false accusation. She was a leader, preparing for a war. The path ahead was more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. It would require her to walk back into that town square, not as a ghost, but as a reckoning. It would mean facing down Blackwood, his men, and the terrified silence of her own people. It was a gamble with her life, her family's life, and the future of the entire valley. And if it were you standing in that cave, with the fate of your family and your entire town resting on your shoulders, would you have the courage to face them all? The atmosphere in the cave was transformed. The air, once thick with despair, now crackled with a tense, focused energy. What had been a sanctuary of grief was now a war room. Cale, Ilara, and Hemlock huddled around the fire, its light dancing across their determined faces. The charcoal, once the tool of a lonely artist, was now used for strategy. On a large, flat piece of slate, Ilara sketched not a face, but a map, a layout of Blackwood's Manor, with Hemlock pointing out the location of the study, the windows, the patterns of the guards. Her art had found its ultimate purpose. It was the language of their rebellion, a way to visualize a future that was, until this very night, unthinkable. They were no longer three broken individuals. They were a conspiracy, bound by a shared desire for a justice that had long been denied. They worked through the night, their whispers weaving a plan that was both intricate and terrifyingly simple. The annual harvest tithe was in 2 days. The one time of year Blackwood demanded the entire town gather in the square to present him with a portion of their meager earnings. It was a day of ritual humiliation, the perfect stage for their counter-performance. Ilara would make her stand. She would unveil her gallery of truth for all to see. In the chaos that was sure to follow, as Blackwood's rage was focused entirely on her, Hemlock, a man so insignificant Blackwood would never notice his absence, would slip away. He would use the map she had drawn, the key of her art, to find his way to the study and secure the ledger. It was a plan that relied on courage, timing, and the hope that the truth, once seen, could awaken the sleeping conscience of a town. The plan was no longer a dream of charcoal and slate. It was a desperate gamble of flesh and blood. And what was to come would be the most decisive night of her life. The day of the harvest tithe dawned with a cruel, indifferent sun, baking the dust of Haven's End into a fine, choking powder. The air was heavy with a familiar dread, a suffocating blanket of resignation that settled over the valley every year on this day. It was a day of performance, a ritual where the town's collective poverty was put on public display, measured and judged against the impossible standards of Silas Blackwood's greed. He stood on a raised platform in the center of the square. a dark king surveying his broken kingdom. A ledger of debts opened before him like a holy text. His voice, amplified by the unnatural silence of the crowd, was a lash, each word a new cut as he called forth families to present their meager offerings, their faces masks of strained humility. This was the pinnacle of his power, the moment he savored most, when the fear of an entire community was a palpable thing he could almost taste on the air. Into this carefully orchestrated theater of humiliation, she walked. She did not emerge from the crowd, a reluctant participant in their shared shame. She entered from the dusty road leading out of the valley, the same road she had fled down in terror weeks before. But the girl who returned was not the one who had left. The fear was gone, burned away, and replaced by a cold, luminous calm that was more unnerving than any threat. Her dress was still simple, but it was clean, and she walked not with the frantic pace of a fugitive, but with the measured, deliberate steps of a priestess approaching an altar. In her arms she carried several large, flat pieces of slate wrapped in burlap, their contents a mystery that sent a ripple of uneasy whispers through the assembled townspeople. Her eyes were fixed on one man, and one man only, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood saw her. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a smug, predatory smile. The ghost had returned. The fool had walked back into the trap. This was a gift, a perfect opportunity to make his final, most brutal example. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, watching, waiting to see how he would handle this insolent spectre. He would enjoy this. He raised a hand, silencing the murmurs, his smile widening into a sneer. He opened his mouth to deliver the first verbal blow, to mock her, to order her seized, but he never got the chance, because in that moment Ilara began her own performance, and it was one that needed no words. With a fluid, graceful movement, she knelt and unwrapped the first piece of slate. She held it aloft, turning it slowly so that every person in that sun-drenched square could see. The image on it was rendered in stark, haunting strokes of charcoal. It was a portrait of a woman, beautiful but fading, the hollows under her eyes a testament to a long illness, her smile a brave, heartbreaking lie. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was Anya, Ilara's mother. It was not just a picture. It was a memory, a shared grief made tangible. The townspeople were not seeing a drawing of a stranger. They were seeing the woman who had shared her bread when she had little, the woman whose laughter had once been a rare melody in this valley. They were seeing a life that poverty and Blackwood's indifference had extinguished. Before the shock could settle, she revealed the second slate. This one depicted a man's back, his shoulders stooped under an invisible weight, the muscles knotted with exhaustion, his hands cracked and bleeding. It was her father. John, but it was also every man in that square. It was the physical embodiment of their endless, thankless labor. The men in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, a few unconsciously rubbing their own aching shoulders. She had drawn their pain, their silent, daily sacrifice, and held it up for the world to see. The silence in the square was no longer one of fear. It was becoming one of profound, dawning recognition. The third slate showed a group of children, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes large and hungry, yet still holding a fragile spark of hope. They were playing in the shadow of a large, dark building that loomed over them, a representation of Blackwood's manor. It was a picture of innocence trapped, of futures already owned and sold. Mothers in the crowd pulled their own children closer, their hands tightening on their shoulders. Ilara was not just telling her own story, she was telling theirs. Each portrait was a mirror, and for the first time, the people of Haven's End were being forced to look at their own reflections, and they did not like what they saw. Blackwood's face had transformed from smug amusement to a mask of purple, twitching rage. This was not the pathetic plea of a beggar he had expected. This was an attack, a mutiny fought with charcoal and stone. She was taking control of his stage, stealing his audience, and turning his ritual of power into a tribunal against him. He could feel the emotional tide of the crowd shifting the solid ground, of their fear turning to a treacherous sea of empathy. She was reminding them that they were a community, not just a collection of individual debtors, and that their suffering was a shared wound inflicted by a single hand. Then came the final, devastating blow. Ilara unveiled the last and largest slate. It was a portrait of him. But it was not the man of power and authority he saw in his mirror. It was a grotesque caricature, a man whose form was made of grasping shadows, his face a twisted sneer of contempt. From his dark, insubstantial body, thin, smoky tendrils reached out, wrapping themselves around the small, leaning shacks of the town, squeezing them, draining the life from them. It was a masterful, terrifying depiction of his soul, a visual representation of the parasite he was. It was the truth of him, stripped of all pretense, and it was hideous. That was the moment he broke. "Seize her!" he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "Seize the thief! She is a liar, a witch!" He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara, his eyes bulging. His two guards, brutish men who enforced his will without question, started to move forward, their hands reaching for the clubs at their belts. The crowd flinched, the old fear reasserting itself. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the spell was broken, that the habits of a lifetime of submission would win out. Ilara stood her ground, her face pale but resolute, her eyes never leaving Blackwood's. She had done all she could. Her life now rested in the hands of the very people who had watched in silence as she was cast out. And you who are listening to this story, what would you do in that moment? When the tyrant you have feared your entire life screams an order, when his enforcers begin to move, when every instinct for self-preservation tells you to lower your eyes, to step back, to let the sacrifice happen so that you might be spared. It is easy to be brave in stories, but in the harsh light of a town square, with the future of your own family hanging in the balance, what does it take to find the courage to take that first, single step? It takes seeing your own truth in someone else's eyes. It takes realizing that your silence will not save you. It will only condemn you to a slower death. As the guards advanced on Ilara, a figure shuffled forward from the front of the crowd. It was not a strong young farmer or a hot-headed youth. It was Martha, the old woman who had been her mother's friend, the same woman who had scurried away from her in terror at the edge of the woods. Her face was a mess of tears and resolve. She did not say a word. She simply stepped in front of Ilara, her frail body becoming a shield. The guards paused, confused. Then, from the other side, another figure moved. A farmer, his face grim, stood beside Martha, then the baker's wife, her eyes no longer wide with fear, but narrowed with a newfound anger. Within seconds, a wave of humanity surged forward, not in a rush, but in a slow, deliberate tide. They formed a silent human wall around Ilara and her art, their bodies a living testament to the truth she had shown them. They held no weapons. They shouted no slogans. Their power was in their unity, in their simple, profound act of standing together. They did not look at the guards. They looked at Blackwood, and in their collective gaze he saw the end of his reign. His power had never been in his fists or his wealth. It had been in their fear, in their division. He had ruled them by making each family believe they were alone in their suffering. And now that illusion was shattered. He was the one who was alone, a king with no subjects, a wolf surrounded by a flock that had suddenly remembered they were not sheep. It was in this moment of perfect, tense stalemate that a new figure pushed his way through the crowd. It was Old Man Hemlock, his face no longer etched with grief, but with a grim, triumphant purpose. In his hand, he held not a slate, but a thick, leather-bound book. He did not need to shout. He held it up, and the sight of it seemed to suck the very air from Blackwood's lungs. The man's face went from purple rage to a pasty, bloodless white. The secret ledger. The weapon that spoke a language even a corrupt magistrate could not ignore. the final undeniable proof of his crimes. Ilara finally spoke, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent square. "This man told you your debts were the result of your own failures," she said, her voice ringing with a power no one had ever heard from her before. "He told you that you were weak, that you were lazy. But this book in his own hand tells the truth. It tells of the illegal interest he charged, the crops he undervalued, the families he deliberately ruined to seize their land. He did not just profit from your poverty. He manufactured it." The guards looked from the united townspeople to the ledger in Hemlock's hand, and then to the crumbling figure of their master. They saw a man whose authority had evaporated into thin air. Slowly, deliberately, they lowered their clubs and stepped back, melting into the crowd, their allegiance shifting with the tide of power. Blackwood was utterly alone, exposed and defeated, not by an army but by a girl with a piece of charcoal and an old man with a book of secrets. His empire of dust had been brought down by the truth. The aftermath was not a celebration of violence, but a quiet, profound restoration. Blackwood was confined to his own manor, a prisoner in his gilded cage, to await the arrival of a magistrate from the city, a magistrate who could no longer be bought or intimidated now that the entire valley stood as a single, unified witness against him. The first act of the newly empowered town was to go to the dilapidated shed behind the stables. Ilara pushed open the creaking door and saw her father and Leo huddled inside. Her father looked up, his face gaunt, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Leo simply whispered her name, Ilara, and ran into her arms, his small body trembling. She knelt and held him close, burying her face in his hair, the smell of wood smoke and hay a welcome anchor to reality. She looked up at her father, who was now weeping silently, the tears carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "It's over, Papa," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "We're going home. That walk, back across the dusty ground to the small house that had been stolen from them, was the true victory march. It was a journey of only a few hundred yards, but it spanned a universe of pain and injustice. They stepped back over their own threshold, the three of them, a family broken and now remade, their home no longer just a collection of wood and nails, but a symbol of their resilience. In the weeks and months that followed, Haven's End was reborn. The spirit of the place, so long choked by fear, began to breathe again, guided by the truths in Blackwood's own ledger. The town council, with Hemlock at its head, began the slow, arduous process of restoring what had been stolen. Lands were returned, debts were forgiven, and a new system of trade, based on fairness and mutual support, was established. The change was not just economic, it was spiritual. People began to look each other in the eye again. Laughter, a sound once as rare as rain, became a common melody in the streets. They were no longer just neighbors, they were a community. Ilara did not become a leader in the traditional sense. She did not seek power or position. She became something far more important, the town's storyteller, its conscience. Her slates were given a place of honor in the center of the town square, a permanent gallery under the open sky, a reminder of the darkness they had endured and the courage they had found together. She continued to draw, not just the pain of the past, but the hope of the present. Children learning to read, farmers helping each other with the harvest, new homes being built with shared hands. Her art became the living history of their redemption. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, casting the hills in hues of orange and purple, Kyle appeared at her doorway. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that now radiated from her, and at the new drawing she was working on, a portrait of the entire town, their faces turned toward the rising sun. He did not need to say anything. He had given her a spark, and she had turned it into a beacon. "My work here is done," he said softly. "The truth doesn't need a guardian once it has found a voice." Ilara nodded, a deep and abiding gratitude in her heart. He had not saved her. He had shown her how to save herself. He walked away down that same dusty road, a mysterious traveler disappearing back into the world, his purpose served. How many times in our own lives are we put into a cage? Not a cage of iron bars, but one made of judgment, of false accusations, of the world's mistaken idea of who we are. We are told we are not good enough, not strong enough, not worthy. We are branded as failures, as thieves of our own happiness, and we begin to believe it. We live within those invisible walls, our spirits shrinking, our voices growing silent. But this story reminds us of a profound and universal truth. There is always a turning point. There is a moment when the truth we carry inside becomes more powerful than the lies that surround us. It is the moment we decide to pick up our own piece of charcoal, whatever that may be, our voice, our talent, our conviction, and show the world a truth it cannot deny. It is the moment we realize that our own courage can become a mirror for others, empowering them to find theirs. Ilara's journey from a terrified outcast to the soul of her community is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to rise from the ashes of injustice, to reclaim its own story, and to build a new world from the ruins of the old. Her victory was not just for her. It was for anyone who has ever been wrongfully judged, for anyone who has ever felt alone against an overwhelming force. It is a reminder that the deepest night always eventually gives way to the dawn. If this story of transformation, of finding a voice in the suffocating silence, has spoken to a truth in your own heart, let us know. If you have ever faced your own turning point, a moment where you chose to stand up after being knocked down, share that strength with us. Write in the comments below, I too have lived a turning point,